Hello, and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. This week we'll be going over the Shadowlands dungeons, and I will give you my personal rankings of them. I will note that as we go further and further back in expansions, my views will be increasingly informed by just the general vibes of the place, and less about how they function as an M+ dungeon. That being said, I did get KSM in every Shadowlands season, which means I've done the original 8 dungeons at least 3 times at that level, and Tazavesh 2 times. And the current season includes Mists of Tyrna Scythe and Necrotic Wake, so that will probably influence my views as well. And I actually had quite a difficult time coming up with this ranking list, just because Shadowlands dungeons as a whole were pretty great. There weren't any of them that I absolutely dreaded doing, which is not always the case. So without further ado, let's get into it with number 10, Tazavesh the Veiled Market, Solea's Gambit. Now, first and foremost, I want to establish that I love Tazavesh, but I feel very differently about its two halves, and the second half commits what I consider some major dungeon design sins. As a rule, I just enjoy dungeons more when they feel like an actual location, whereas this is definitely more of an event. Like, the first 2/3 of this place don't even occur within the Shadowlands. You're just taking portals around the place in pursuit of Solea. And while I have no ill feelings towards Stormheim or Tiergard Sound, they just don't belong here. Heck, I'm not a huge fan of teleporting around in dungeons even when it's all in the same location. And I don't know if the designers made it this way because they thought it would be cool, or they were just really committed to the idea of an 8-boss mega dungeon and they just didn't know how to fit that many bosses in otherwise. But like, if you actually look at the map of Tazavesh, there's that whole southern area that doesn't get utilized at all, as well as a gap between Soasmi and where you come back to face Solea. Now, I'm sure there are smoke and mirrors involved in that, and it would require some more work on Blizzard's end, but so be it, you know? Personally, I would just cut Hillbrand out altogether and stuff Time Captain Hooktail into the actual city. If you pay attention, there are these death gondolas all over the place, and coming in and landing and whatnot, and docks to accommodate them. And that boss is supposed to be goofy already, so why not have an infinite pirate dragon laying siege to a city located in the realm of death? As for the actual, mechanics of the place, I think they're fine for the most part. It was only 3 bosses, so it was a pretty quick and easy M+ dungeon. That being said, I'm not in love with Hillbrand's mechanics as a dungeon boss. It really encourages you to be in voice comms, which I'm fine for a raid boss. In fact, Mechatork is one of my favorite raid bosses they've ever designed. But at least personally, I wind up pugging M+ a lot more than I wind up pugging raids. So it wound up boiling down to just having an add-on or a weak aura to help you along the way. And that's just kind of lame, Hooktail was kind of whatever as a boss, but I really liked Solea. It's quite a long fight overall, but all of the mechanics are actually pretty fun. I like the orb thing in phase 1 that you keep popping in proper intervals, and the mechanic in phase 2 where your group forms a star pattern to destroy the relics of the first ones is one of those things that feels like it's gonna be really complicated, but it's actually incredibly simple as long as you're all alive. And it just feels good, And then my last criticism for the place would just be the trash leading up to Hillbrand. It's a bunch of Murloc packs, and it's kind of messy. So most groups decided to just invis past it, do the rest of the dungeon, port back, and then clear trash until you hit 100%. And, that also just feels kind of dumb. So yeah, the last boss was phenomenal, but she's not enough to redeem the rest of the place in my eyes. In 9th place, we have The Other Side, which also primarily earned its low place due to design elements. It's kind of a bizarre concept for a dungeon in the first place. You're in Bwonsamni's personal corner of Ardenweald, which I guess he can just travel to even though he is a living Loa, as it were. And I feel like he's only really here because he was a popular character from BFA and they wanted to reuse him. But then the first 3 bosses of this dungeon have you basically acting as his debt collector, going around and collecting mojo from people that he loaned it out to. But one of the 3 wings of the dungeon has you going back into Ardenweald. That feels very strange to me. Why not just have us spawn in there and have that be the mandatory first wing? And you're also sent to Mechagon to collect it from the Mana Storms, and Zul'Gurub to collect it from Hakar. Again, I don't really like when dungeons don't feel like a location. But at the very least, this dungeon doesn't abuse teleports. It just blends the different areas together, which is what I really wish they had done with the Emerald Nightmare raid. I like that place, but my main complaint was that all 7 bosses were separated by portals. But I digress. The dungeon itself is actually pretty fun overall. The Mana Storm banter is always delightful, and I enjoy all of the bosses other than Hakar. He could be a bit of a mess sometimes. Any boss that has a heavy emphasis on ads is going to swing wildly in difficulty once you start to outgear it. And Muzala himself was a pretty fun boss fight. It's just that as a character, he felt kind of wasted here. Maybe that's just because the community hyped him up a bit too much before Shadowlands. There was a lot of speculation going on at the time, so that could be on us. And lastly, it was just the fact that it was probably the longest Shadowlands dungeon. So between that, the Hakar fight, and just general design elements, I can't really place it above the remaining dungeons on this list. And on that note, we have in 8th place, Necrotic Wake. I don't hate this place, but it does have quite a few little things that irk me. Right off the bat, it is an ugly dungeon. Like, Bastion itself is gorgeous, and the Necrolord aesthetic is fine enough, but when you stack Necrolord assets and effects on top of Bastion's color palette, it just does not work. I have half a mind to gouge my eyes out anytime I zone into the place. It's also just not a very fun place to maneuver in. The first half of the dungeon has a lot of excess trash, but it's positioned just close enough that you always feel like you're kind of sneaking around and can't quite relax. And then once you're free of that, you're stuck in one room for like a third of the run, just killing never-ending trash inside of the necropolis, and then killing the third boss in that very same room. I also really hate how dependent the runs are on using the Covenant perks. There's just too many things lying around that you're supposed to use. Granted, the only ones that you really need to use are the spears, all of which you want to use on the third boss. You used to be able to just stack them all together to have a 60% damage increase on him and basically trivialize the fight. Although it has been changed so that they no longer stack, you just use one when the other expires, and the boss has less health to compensate. But that only partially alleviates the fact that you're expected to have the spears for this boss. Between the spears being one-time use and Lust having a 10-minute cooldown, if you wipe on him, your key is pretty much bricked. I say just nerf his health even more and make the spears only usable on trash. That way they remain helpful, but not absolutely essential. Having said all of that, I don't actually dislike any of the bosses here. I actually think Stitchflesh's gimmick of hooking him with his own abominations is pretty fun. And I really enjoy the last boss. He's a bit easier, so if you get to him, you can kind of unwind. Moving on upward to 7th place, we have Plaguefall, which is also ugly, but in a good way. It's got all of your typical Maldraxxus design elements, bones and pustules and whatnot, but that's how the place should look, so I don't mind it nearly as much. Unfortunately, like with Necrotic Wake, the first half has you feeling like you're sneaking around a bit too much, and it wasn't uncommon to skip some of the first boss's trash, so good luck if you wipe there. The first boss was probably the most annoying one. He would spawn ads every now and then, but they were all spread out, and you couldn't let any of them reach him, but they had too much HP to just nuke down, so you had to coordinate CC a little bit. Not a huge deal, but it could get messy. The boss to the second trash was still a little sneaky, but not too bad, but then once you get to the actual boss room, Ickis will start jumping around between platforms, and you have to time your pulls to not have him jump on you while you're there, or at least pull the trash off to the side so he won't aggro. He's also a slightly annoying boss just because he has a lot of ads you need to kill, has some pretty quick AoE effects that you need to avoid, and again, he'll jump between the platforms in the middle of the fight. The trash to the third boss also had a few tedious elements. It's where the environmental damage for the place is most prevalent, even if it's not that big of a threat, and there were the ambusher mobs that you had to nuke down before they would spawn spider ads. The third boss, Domina, was pretty fun overall, but could also be annoying in her own way. You, for the most part, had to stay stacked, but if you got the debuff, you had to run out to not drop it on the group, but then you had to get right back to the group because you could only be away for a few seconds. She would also periodically spawn assassins who were just untargetable until you pop them out of their spiderwebs with AoE effects, which isn't too bad, but they could be spread out enough to make it a bit of a chore. And I don't think I had any major complaints with Stradama or her trash. I actually really enjoyed her boss fight. The dance you have to do to avoid the tentacles is pretty fun. I guess if anything, it's a bit annoying how many ads she spawns. I know it sounds like I did nothing but complain about this dungeon, but any of the individual things I did mention were fairly minor. Minor enough to allow it to beat out the 3 previous dungeons. But because it feels like there's always something that could be agitating you, this is as high as it's gonna go. In 6th place, we have the Spires of Ascension. As I said earlier, Kyrian and Bastion aesthetics are absolutely beautiful. None of the trash or the bosses are overly bothersome. In fact, I enjoy all of the bosses, though the first boss is almost laughably easy. And Devos did have the one annoying part of her fight where someone would have to spear her down, but all too often she would move right as they were using the spear and you would have to go collect orbs again. Which, I mean, obviously you're just supposed to wait until after she moves, but still. I'd I'd say the only thing I really don't like about the place is the layout. Your typical run would involve you interacting with the Kyrian to have them fly you to the next platform 5 times. Just let us run free, Blizzard. And it could be a bit annoying if you wiped on Devos just because you had that long flight up from the bottom every time. But that's more just a case of it feeling bad because that was literally the entire run back, so not too bad. So overall, a breathtaking and very enjoyable place. And we're only halfway through the list. Shadowlands dungeons absolutely slapped. In 5th place, we have the Halls of Atonement. First and foremost, as a Venthyr, let me say that the Covenant perk was my favorite one of the entire set. You basically got to turn the Gravewings throughout the dungeon into your pets for about 45 seconds. It was incredibly easy to use, but it was very fun and made you feel cool. For the most part, I didn't really have any gripes with the trash. The 3 tombstone mobs that you had to deal with before Halkias did periodically do big group damage, but it was pretty predictable and you could react accordingly. Unfortunately, because of count and there not really being any other good parts to cut out, you skipped basically the entirety of Echelon's trash, which is okay, it just feels kind of weird, and I'm glad dungeon design has sort of gravitated away from all of these invis runs. Echelon himself was probably my least favorite boss of the dungeon. He could be a bit of a mess sometimes, but he makes up for it by having one of the best entrances in the game. I also wasn't a huge fan of the trash before Lord Chamberlain in what feels like a chapel of sorts. All of the mobs there basically didn't move at all, or they did very unreliably. So it was sort of an AoE situation, but because they weren't moving, the tank couldn't really establish threat on all of them. And there was just a ton of them, so it wound up being this really long, protracted AoE pull where you're kind of in danger the whole time, and would usually wind up having to pop a defensive or two just to survive. But those are really all my complaints about the dungeon. The rest is fantastic. Halkias is pretty fun. You have limited space, but the tank can move the boss to sort of refresh your space. The 3rd boss was just really easy, but I'm not complaining. And I really liked Lord Chamberlain as well. The fight was basically dodge the sin stones that he's throwing at you, and have 4 players soak the beams, ideally with a defensive up, and dodge the cone. So a very fun dungeon overall, with just a few pain points, but those get alleviated by the fact that you have the vampire aesthetic the whole time. In 4th place, we have Mists of Tyrna. This is a very delightful dungeon overall, with one very contentious aspect to it. You know what I'm talking about, and we'll get to it. But first of all, I want to say that the Covenant perk was one of the better ones. Night Fae could unlock a very short, borderline useless shortcut, but more importantly gave access to the buff mushrooms just before the first boss, and unlocked respawn points right after the first and second bosses. That last one is arguably too important to relegate to a perk, though thankfully the first of those can now be unlocked by anyone. They've also changed it so that those perks are now tied to being a Tauren, High Mountain Tauren, Night Elf, or Herbalist, which is fine in and of itself, but oddly enough, being a Night Fae doesn't work anymore. I guess they just didn't want to encourage players to go back and unlock or switch their covenants. But is it really worth it to have players who played as Night Fae the whole expansion go into that place and be unable to use those perks? But not a big deal overall, I guess. The first boss is pretty fun, although he does have a heavy emphasis on his burn phase. If you're not able to get him down or close to down in one, it can massively inflate how much time you're spending on this fight. The second boss is just good fun all around. I love the matching game there. The 3rd boss, Tredova, is probably the most annoying of the 3, but not that bad, honestly. It's just lots of movement, add control, and trying not to outrange your healer. I also don't really have a problem with any of the trash in this place. But obviously, the elephant in the room here is the maze, where the different paths each have a mark associated with them, and to find the right path, you have to find the marker with the odd trade out. Conceptually, this is very fun, and I honestly get a bit annoyed that people rely on add-ons and weak auras to trivialize it. But I also get it, because it can be very frustrating at the same time. And this has a lot to do with how short-term memory works. For the overwhelming majority of adult humans, we're able to retain about 5 to 7 pieces of new information that haven't been committed to long-term memory. Now for this maze, you're dealing with 4 marks that each have 3 pieces of information to them. Is it a leaf or a flower? Is it filled in or hollow? Is there a ring or no ring? So 4 marks, 3 traits to each of them, that's 12 pieces of information. That's just too much for most individuals to retain. Now there are ways to help with this. Firstly, you can just compress the information in some way. For instance, if there's a hollow flower with no ring, you could just remember that as hollow flower. You don't need to actively remember that there was no ring, because if there was one, then you would mention it. And some people can really rely on their visual memory here. If you can just remember the picture of a filled in leaf with a ring, then you don't necessarily need to retain those 3 separate pieces of information. But all of that gets complicated even further by the fact that you're usually trying to solve this while fighting trash. And just for kicks and giggles, some of the Vorkai mobs, the Guardians I believe, will charge you and knock you back periodically. And furthermore, you have to be standing right next to the stumps for the marks to show up, which itself can interfere with your ability to maneuver your camera. Now, I will say that there are strategies that can be used to streamline the process a bit. And I tried some of these strategies, but none of them were 100% effective. And frankly, I feel like a lot of this discussion is moot because I don't believe you were intended to solve it on your own. This is made most obvious by the fact that the symbols disappear if you're not standing by the stumps. And if 4 people just spread out so all were visible at the same time, this puzzle would be stupidly easy. There's a reason nobody complains about the mechanic when it shows up on Mistcaller, but groups just never do this. They want it to be solved before the trash is dead, and it's too much of a hassle to get into position while fighting trash. So it will generally just be relegated to the healer or whoever is running the add-on or weak aura. And if things are going to be like that anyways, I would prefer if Blizzard just tweaked how the maze worked. Make the symbols stay up permanently or only be visible after you've killed the trash in that room. Just do something. It's a fun idea, it's just a bit imperfectly implemented. So that was a lot to say about just the maze, but it's really the only part of the dungeon that I think needs to be improved upon. It's also just a nice and quick dungeon. It's the opposite of the other side in that regard. But we're up to the bronze. In 3rd place, we have the Sanguine Depths. It's an extremely linear dungeon, but there's nothing wrong with that in moderation. Unfortunately, that did mean that optimal runs required you to invis part of the trash. I didn't enjoy the anima jars quite as much as the Grave Wings, but they weren't bad. You would just pull an AoE pack on top of them and open it when the first mobs were about ready to die. None of the trash was overly difficult. You had to be a little sneaky at times, but not as bad as previous dungeons. And the camera work could be a bit tricky since you spent a lot of the run moving around in these tight underground corridors. Even the gauntlet portion before the last boss really wasn't too bad. Call would show up every other trash pack 3 times in total, and then disappear once you had taken off 10% of her health. It felt a lot more perilous than it actually was. And I really enjoy every boss in this place. The first one was a bit of a damage sponge, but not too difficult. The second boss was really cool with those anima waves that would travel around the entire ring, although it took me way too long to realize that it was an actual complete ring just because my groups would always go to the left. The third boss wasn't too bad, you just had to have each member in your group soak 3 or 4 orbs. Or if you had someone with immunities, they could do that and give the rest of your party members more orbs to choose from. And the last boss was basically just get in the dome when she does her squall, spread out properly for her charge, and dance between the 3/3 of the platform. I was actually surprised just how highly I ranked this place. I think it's because it earned a bad reputation early on because it was a bit overtuned, and that colored my impression of it for a long time, but looking back on it, I never really hated running this place, at least in the latter seasons. I also just tend to favor dungeons that are mostly indoors. They tend to feel more snug. For our silver medalist, we have Theater of Pain. I feel like a lot of people didn't love this place, but I adored it. For most of the dungeon, you're just moving around this underground compound beneath the Colosseum. And like I just said, I prefer when my dungeons are indoors. In fact, one of my few complaints about this place is that the 1st and 5th bosses take place in the same location, and that location is already overused. It features heavily in the level up quests, in just world quests, and was also turned into a PvP arena. But like I said, I love the underground section. I like that you can do each of the 3 wings in any order you want, and they all circle back to the middle. There were a few mobs to watch out for, but overall, none of the trash was super scary. And really the only somewhat annoying trash part was the platforms that you had to put the orbs into and fly between. Though I will say it was quite funny whenever someone got knocked off by dark winds. The first boss and the Lich boss are both just fine. I quite like the Gladiator boss, even if the mechanic doesn't quite work out. Like, you're supposed to duel one of your party members, and whoever wins gets the buff, but the most effective strategy is to just let the burst to your DPS kill the other player. But it's still a fun concept, and I like that it extended to a lot of his trash, where these 2 big guys would be fighting one another, one of them would randomly die, and you would have to kill the victor. And I think this boss was kind of hated, but I really liked the Abomination guy. You just had to dance around, kill ads, and not get hit by any of the hooks. The last boss could get pretty hectic, but again, I feel like there was a dance to the fight that you could sort of learn over time. So for a long time, this was my reigning champion dungeon of the expansion, until they released our gold medalist, Tazavesh, the Veiled Market, Streets of Wonder. That is to say, the first 5 bosses of Tazavesh. This place is an absolutely phenomenal dungeon. Probably my favorite mega dungeon they've ever made, despite not really liking the latter half of it. It's a very unique environment for a dungeon. It's basically this trade city of the brokers. And they really did do a great job of making it feel like an actual city. The first boss area is basically a bank/auction house. And once you do beat the first boss, you can actually access the bank and auction house here. That's so cool. One of the boss encounters basically feels like a black market auction house, and the trash leading up to it feels like the stables area of the city. Another of the boss encounters takes place in what feels like the inn of the city. It's a cantina, for crying out loud. And the trash before that is basically the professions area. I'd say the professions area here is bigger than it was in Oribos. There is some speculation that this was originally meant to be our capital hub for Shadowlands, and that it got switched to Oribos at some point. I could definitely see that, but I also totally buy that they just made a dungeon that feels like a city. I feel that they probably would have been better off swapped. Yes, Oribos would have been somewhat boring no matter what, but I feel like it would have been far easier to stomach if it was just one of 9 dungeons that we were running. But yeah, there's not really any part of this half of the dungeon that I didn't like. Even the gauntlet of sorts in the profession area that you have to do to unlock Miza's Oasis isn't that bad. It's usually pretty obvious where you're supposed to go. All of the bosses are pretty enjoyable, honestly. I think the male boss could get a bit hectic at times, but it wasn't too bad. And it's just kind of funny that we had like a rock band Guitar Hero boss. Though the coolest of them conceptually was definitely So Asmi, the last boss of the wing, who would cut the room into halves and then corridors, and you would have to use the matching shaped teleporters to move between them to avoid the wave that he put out, and then also get to him and interrupt him twice to stop his big cast. Of course, I say that as a mage who could just blink most of those mechanics, but whatever, it's still cool. Also, just a neat little Easter egg, inside of the cantina, you can find Gallywix doing business with some brokers. I miss you, Gallywix. So yeah, definitely one of the best half of a dungeons they've ever made. I'm going to continue moving backwards in expansions for these ranking videos, so next up will be BFA. I'm going to try to stick to doing them every 13 weeks or every quarter of a year, and I haven't given it a ton of thought yet, but if the first 2 victors are any indication, the third winner will just be whatever the purpliest dungeon is. Anyway, for this week's drawing, I of course drew the Streets of Wonder. I went with a far more open area, just because I feel like you have to represent this place properly, and it was a bit difficult just because, you know, there's a lot to include and perspective and all that stuff that I'm not good at. But I'm content with how it turned out. You can also see to the left side, sort of in the background there, is what looks like a big dock area. We can't actually go there ourselves, but hey, you know, that'd be a neat place to stick Time Captain Hooktail. Sorry, it's just Blizzard was so close to perfection. I'm being nitpicky though. I also didn't really realize it back in Shadowlands, but broker architecture feels kind of Arabian, and that's kind of neat. But that's it for this episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye!